Good morning. Boston, how you doing today? A room full of decaf drinkers. It's really nice to meet you all. It's very exciting to be here. So my name is Ethan Marcotte. I'm Beep on Twitter. And for the next 40 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit of a story about how I think responsive design as a practice is starting to move beyond our devices. To do so, I'd like to tell you about a random image I found on the internet, because I'm a professional. But I think this is actually a really special image. This image, if you're able to see the screens to my sides, was created in 2012 by a history professor named Ben Schmidt. And I think on the face of it, just as a piece of work, it's rather beautiful. It's sweeping, it's moving, it's ephemeral. It's some simple black and gray lines moving over a white background. It almost feels like a snapshot of smoke. But the thing is, this isn't just a pretty bit of abstract fluff someone cooked up in Photoshop. You see, Professor Schmidt specializes in visualizing data so that it can help him better understand his field of study, the history of the 19th century. So what he did was he took data from over 2 centuries worth of ocean journeys, plotted each one of them, traced them out, and then overlaid them on top of each other. So the result is what you might see on the image before you. Over 200 years of humanity's maritime exploration collapsed into a single frame, compressed into a single image. Now, what I think is even more moving, if you'll pardon the terrible dad joke, is the time-lapse video of that image being created in real time by the professor's computer, showing ships' journeys for each month beginning in August of 1830. So each fleeting or dancing line you might see on the screen is one ship's journey, its port of origin and its destination, and the countries they may have visited along that route. In other words, the countries they visited, explored, and ultimately returned to. And you'll notice in many, many of those cases, some of those ships never actually return home. I wanted to start today with a story about this image and about this video, not just because I love the story itself, but because, for better and for worse, human history is founded on exploration. You know, as a species, we're never quite satisfied with our current position, with our status quo. We always crave movement and we crave direction, even sometimes when we don't have either of those things. One of the many reasons I love Todd's introductory notes was because if I was going to compress most of the conversations I've had about the state of responsive design, or heck, even the state of web design in the last few years, they'd sound very similar to the questions Todd asked us first thing. In fact, I could boil most of those conversations down into this one simple sounding question: where are we going? Now, just to be clear, there's usually a little bit of fear in the eyes of the person asking me this question, because I think in very real ways, as Todd beautifully illustrated, we were caught off guard, especially in more developed markets, by the explosive rise of mobile. Our practices and our ways of thinking about digital design were completely changed by the explosive growth we saw there. And I say explosive quite intentionally because, I mean, even today, there's some 8 billion mobile devices estimated to be in use worldwide. This is, by and large, the default way in which our audiences are engaging with our digital work. And tablet computing is not the newest kid on the block anymore, but it's still incredibly exciting. We're a few years out from this, but it still floors me that in 2011 alone, some 80 tablet devices entered the marketplace in one 12-month period. So with all that growth and with all that churn, I think it's perfectly natural to look at our industry today and see all this investment and experimentation in trying to understand what else lies for us as we move further and further beyond the desktop, designing for smart TVs and other kinds of embedded computing, including some screens that happen to be on our wrists now today. So with all this change and with all this churn, I can't answer that question: where are we going? In fact, I would go so far as to say nobody in this room can definitively answer that question. But what I can tell you is where I've been going as a digital designer over the last few years. And it's a journey that I think some of you might be on as well. Because I've been seeing myself move further and further away from this idea of a page as the single central organizing principle for most of the digital design work that I do on the modern web. And instead, I've been seeing my practice embrace more modular, more design pattern-driven practices. And this is a big shift for me because in the old days, when I thought about designing an interface for my audiences, I would basically open up Photoshop or Illustrator and I would create a grid. I'd create an abstract system of columns and rows, and then I would fill that grid with stuff, with all the content, the features, and functionality that a user of that page would expect to find on that layout when they opened it up in their browser or their device. But with all the devices and contexts we're designing for, now more than ever, our practice has to begin its process a level below the page. A good friend and colleague of mine named Trent Walton talked about his transition from kind of a responsive design skeptic into somebody who I would argue is doing some of the best cross-device work out there today. And he said that he traded the control he had in Photoshop for a new kind of control, one in which he could use the ingredients of responsive design, flexible grids, flexible images, and media queries to build not a page, but a network of content that can be rearranged at any screen size to best convey a message. Now, regardless of whether you're a web developer or native app developer, I can't think of a better way of designing, of epitomizing the kind of work that we do in modern digital practices. Because at least for me as a web designer, I can't think of a better way of thinking about my work not as a page, but as a network of content. So when I'm building an interface, I don't look at this as something that's going to change and adapt at the same rate across different breakpoints. I'm going to look at this page level below itself and look at the individual design patterns that go into building that larger interface. And looking at those individual pieces of the design as little responsive layouts themselves. Some of them might change and adapt more frequently or more dramatically than some other design patterns that might sit next to them in the overall UI. But it's by looking at these individual design patterns and understanding how they need to change and adapt that I can then stitch them together more effectively and more quickly than I ever could before in old page-driven models. I mention this because design pattern-driven practices have changed the way that I think about designing for the web, maybe more dramatically than responsive design, maybe even more dramatically than mobile. They've changed the way that I think about digital design in so many subtle, significant ways. Let me give you an example from a project I worked on a few years ago. This is a redesign I worked on with some colleagues for an independent publication called The Toast, and they had a significant back catalog that they were independently publishing at the time. And it's a completely responsive UI, so you could view this on any size screen and any size viewport, and it'll completely intelligently reform itself regardless of how wide your screen happens to be. And you'll notice that as you're browsing through this website, there is a ton of stuff on it. But you'll also probably notice that every single one of their hundreds and hundreds of pages are actually displayed using a relatively small number of unique design patterns that present that content to you. And some of these patterns are more complex, like the masthead, for example, will change and adapt more dramatically from mobile to desktop than something like a headline that appears in the main content well. And as I said before, much of our design practice was actually looking at these individual patterns and understanding how they needed to change and then how they could fit together. Now, there's one design pattern in particular that I want to call your attention to, which we actually sort of thought of as the real workhorse for this responsive design, which is something that we independently started calling the teaser. Now, from the name, you might guess that this is teasing content from the back catalog for this particular publication. And the teaser actually had a number of different forms as a design pattern. In its simplest form, it was just a headline with a link that was promoting content from the back catalog. More often than not, though, it would be accompanied by a thumbnail, give it a little bit more visual heft. Sometimes this teaser would actually have a large prominent number associated with it to give it sort of a ranking context. But the version of the teaser your eye has probably noticed more than these others is the most visually dense one that appears in the main river of information on the home page and on the section fronts. Now, if you were to look at these little snippets of design in isolation from each other, it's perfectly natural to assume that they're completely different design patterns. But under the hood, these modules are all effectively identical. They're just presented a little bit differently depending on where they sit in the design, and they might have additional content or information maybe stapled onto them conditionally. Now, I want to call your attention to this most visually dense version of the teaser, because this sort of symbolized one of those points in which I caught myself reflecting on how my design process had changed, thanks to a pattern-driven thinking. Now, when we came up with this solution for this particular version of the teaser, I loved one subtle detail of it, which is this kind of like tiny inversion of priorities. The most important piece of information inside of this design pattern, the article headline, is not actually the first thing that you might see. It's actually sort of bracketed by metadata. The most important piece of content, or the most visual piece of content that you experience first, is the byline and category, and then the comment count. Then you have the article headline, and then you have the summary underneath. Now, if I was the front-end developer who was tasked with turning this into a prototype, and you were the designer handing me this mock-up, well, I would basically look at the design, and if this was back in the old days, like 6 months ago, I would basically look at the visual placement of each one of those pieces of information and basically use that as my marching order for when I was creating the web prototype for this particular piece of design. So I would basically look at the visual placement of those elements and basically sort of mirror that hierarchy in my markup for this particular pattern. So starting with the byline and category, and then the comment count, and then the article title, and then finally the excerpt underneath it. This is one of those areas when I stopped and I caught myself, and I realized this wasn't the best way to proceed. You see, as a responsive designer, as somebody who creates digital experiences for the modern web, there's this one question that I ask myself at pretty much every stage of my process, and it's incredibly important to my practice. I'm going to share it with you, lovely people, today. What if someone doesn't browse the web like I do? Realize that doesn't sound like much in a room full of relative strangers. I'm very sorry about that. But it's really hard for me to overstate just how important this is for my design practice. Because this is a great way for me to step out of my default assumptions and biases about how someone's going to be experiencing this digital design I'm working on, and reminding myself that my experience isn't representative of everyone else's. And this is helpful in a whole bunch of different ways. For example, if I'm the visual lead on a project and I'm working on a widescreen mock-up for an interface, asking myself in that moment, what if someone doesn't browse the web like I do, is a great reminder to foreground the needs of the mobile user at that point in time. I may not necessarily be working on these two designs side by side, but it's a great reminder that they're all part of the same experience, that decisions I make on the widescreen end of the spectrum can't impinge on the experience for the mobile user, and vice versa. But if we turn back to our prototype and to this one particular design pattern, asking myself, what if someone doesn't browse the web like I do, was a great reminder for me in that moment that not everyone is going to see the web like I do. And if you think about this for a moment, put aside the visual design we've been talking about, the most important piece of information, the article title, has effectively been buried in the code that powers this little design pattern. And imagine how disorienting it might be if someone's having this information read aloud to them in a non-visual context by a speaking browser, like VoiceOver on iOS. And imagine how disorienting it might be if they're hearing this metadata before they hear the name of the article title that it's actually associated with. So this, for me, was an incredibly important reminder that it's incredibly important for every responsive designer or web developer to actually begin their process by designing the priority of the information they're delivering to the end user, independent of the layout and the aesthetics that might actually be supporting that content. So to put that in practice, I could then go back to the visual design we as a team had agreed upon, that our client had approved, and I could kind of step back from the layout itself and instead take a look at the the content hierarchy that I was trying to deliver to the user. So again, the most important piece of information, as I've been sort of yammering on about for the last few minutes, was the article title. And then the byline and category, I would say, is the second most important piece of information. And then I decided the third most important piece of information was the article summary at the bottom, and the least important piece of content was the one that was maybe most visually prominent, the comment count that appears in the top right corner of this design pattern. Now, maybe after this talk out in the hallway, we could have a particularly nerdy debate about whether or not you agree with this little outline. It would be very boring, but I would be very there for it. But regardless, this felt right for me in terms of the content we were actually delivering to the end user. So with that in mind, I could then go back to my prototype and come up with something that honored that content hierarchy and that also lightly matched up with the typography that the client had agreed upon, moving from the article title all the way down to the comment count. And in fact, if you then went into the prototype, you could see that I'd perfectly mirrored this content hierarchy inside of my markup. In other words, as the content hierarchy needed to go, so did the code. Now, I want to be very clear. If I'd showed this design to my client, I would have been fired, because this isn't the design that they had approved, right? In fact, this wasn't as a design that we as a team had agreed was the best solution to this particular problem. But this is the foundation that we could then use to finish the refined UI. So in other words, with this content in place, what I could then do is start to bolster the markup a little bit that powered this design pattern. So I could surround those first two pieces of content with some sort of containing element. And then basically the article title and byline sit directly underneath them. And then I could apply a slightly more advanced version of CSS to that containing element to sort of turn off the gravity inside of that container. So without changing the content hierarchy itself, but thanks to these two lines of CSS, the byline would float to the top and the article title would float to the bottom from a visual standpoint. Now, the great thing about this code is that it allows you this level of flexibility to change the visual presentation of content without changing the underlying structure. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything for elements that sit outside of that container, like my poor comment count that's nestled down in the bottom. Now, ideally, what I'd like to see happen is that I'd like to take that comment count out of its default position and anchor it in the top right corner if the browser supports this more advanced layout model. So to do that, to figure out if the browser supports this more advanced code, I kind of had to ask the browser if it supported this more advanced code. Now, since this was more than 6 months ago, I initially took a stab at this with a JavaScript-driven solution, where I would basically run a quick little test in the browser to see if it supported that flexbox-driven layout, and then conditionally apply a class to the HTML element to conditionally layer on those styles just for those browsers that passed that test. What I'm more excited about as a responsive designer is that we're actually getting the flexibility to ask these questions directly in our CSS for the first time. We've been writing media queries for our responsive designs for years, but we now have the flexibility to write feature queries using the @supports rule. So we can directly ask in our CSS if certain CSS property value pairs are actually supported by that device. And if it passes that test and says, yes, I do in fact support display flex as a property value pair, then I can conditionally apply those more advanced rules for those devices that pass that feature test and also that understand feature queries. Now, regardless of how you decide to actually approach this particular problem from an implementation standpoint, what we're talking about at the end of the day is a baseline structure and layout that meets the needs of the content we're actually trying to serve to our end users. But then we can maybe take elements that aren't necessarily in their ideal refined position, but use this baseline structure and layout to conditionally enhance up from there to the browsers and devices that meet our criteria for a more modern experience. In other words, what this means for me in every responsive design that I've worked on in the last few years is that supporting a device or supporting a browser doesn't mean that every single device or browser gets the same exact experience. And what's more, this has actually been at the heart of most responsive designs at scale over the last few years. Publishers like the Boston Globe here in town, or The Guardian is another really wonderful example. They have sort of a semi-responsive layout that you'll notice is very tightly composed. It's neatly gridded, and it has a lot of really pleasing interactions with the different parts of its design. But this is also a flexbox-driven layout, although they're using it much more extensively than we did on the Toast. But it's also worth noting that this particular layout is also conditionally enhanced. Much as we did on the Toast, they're asking a couple questions in JavaScript to see if certain more advanced CSS rules are actually supported by the device or browser that's rendering the design. If it passes the test, then we get the layout that you and I might see on our devices and on our laptops. But if it fails that test, there's still a baseline foundational experience that may not necessarily meet your and my expectations of a modern web experience, but it's still fairly attractive. And what's more, it affords access to every device and every browser on the planet that can understand HTML and CSS to get access to the Guardian's content, to their stories. In other words, I firmly believe, now more than ever in 2018, as we look to the challenges in front of us, that a well-crafted responsive design, and heck, a well-crafted digital design has to be device agnostic by default. Now, device agnostic is it's a very broad-sounding term. It's almost a little bit of a buzzword, said the guy who coined the term responsive design. Sorry, glass houses. But I actually think this is an incredibly powerful guiding principle for designing for the modern web. I mentioned Trent Walton in my introduction, and he actually said that this is something that he focuses on in his digital practice, because we're dealing with more than just differently sized screens across all these different devices. We're dealing with hostile browsers that don't care about perfectly representing our designs and our code to the end user. We're dealing with screens that are wider and smaller than they've ever been before. We're dealing with networks that are incredibly fast, but also slower and more flaky than we could possibly think of, and also more input mechanisms on these devices than we could ever think of. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at a screen like this, I get a little pit of fear in my stomach about all the challenges we have to deal with when we're designing for the modern web. But Trent actually says that this is actually incredibly helpful to focus on these challenges and start from there. He says that like cars designed to perform in extreme heat or on icy roads, websites should be built to face the reality of the web's inherent variability. And I love that line. As the guy who coined the term responsive design, I've been talking about for the last few years about we need to talk about the web's inherent variability. I've said in my writings and in my conference talks that the web is the first truly flexible design medium. There's really never been anything like it. But it's only been in the last few years that I've understood that that flexibility has to encompass other parts of the user experience as well, not just differently sized screens. I mean, think about the networks that we use on a daily basis to publish our work, to browse the web, to reach our audiences. These networks are more broadly accessed today than at any other point in its history, but they're also far slower than we might like to think about when we talk about what constitutes good design for the modern web. A good friend of mine, Scott Gell, who works at Filament Group, which is headquartered here in Boston, they talked about how at their agency that they don't disable JavaScript just to test how a site works with JavaScript disabled, as though anybody actually does that. He goes on to say that we do it to test how a site works in non-ideal net and browsing conditions. And I think that's actually an incredibly important term, non-ideal, because we tend to talk about our designs in very idealized terms. In fact, I tend to hear terms like mobile and tablet and desktop in most of the discussions I have with my clients about responsive designs, and these are maybe some of the worst words when you're actually talking about multi-device design, in my practice at least, because they conceal a lot of very real challenges that we do actually need to design for. And everyone has a different definition, at least in the stakeholders and clients I speak with, about what mobile means, or what tablet means, or what desktop means. So that's why, at least in my practice, I try to work with my clients to break past these really broad device categories and instead focus in on the specific conditions and features that might cause our designs to adapt. To talk about the input method or mechanisms on a device independent of the size of that screen, or to talk about the speed of the network independent of its overall reliability. You know, when we hear the term mobile, I think even today, especially for mobile professionals like us, a lot of people that I intersect with at least still tend to think about these devices that tend to fall along the left-hand side of the table. They're relatively small screen devices that are primarily driven by touch, maybe not on the fastest network, and maybe not on the most reliable network either. But what happens if that device is connected to a Wi-Fi network that's fairly reliable as well? It's being used on a home network or on office. Or what if somebody doesn't actually see the screen, as you and I might, and they're having the contents of our apps and our websites read aloud to them by a speaking browser? That's also a mobile use case, and one that we actually haven't done a great job of designing for in our industry by and large. So that's why I think, broadly speaking, it's incredibly important to have those discussions about the non-ideal areas of use. And most of the websites and web applications that I've worked on in the last few years spend most of their time on that refined UI that you and I might see on more modern devices and browsers, but we still ensure that there's something usable underneath it, something that affords access, something that might be a single column experience by default that's mobile friendly, but one that we can use as the foundation for that more refined UI. So I think we have to look for these opportunities as digital professionals to design for those non-ideal areas of use. And if we can do that and look for those opportunities to do that not just at the page level, but all the individual patterns that power our responsive websites or our digital apps, then the result is we're going to have digital designs that are as resilient and as responsive as they possibly can be. It's going to ensure that your entire site or your entire product is better equipped to deal with the web's challenging adverse conditions. Now, I realize I've been kicking off this talk with a lot of talk about design and implementation, and I do apologize about that. I've only had one cup of coffee, and I love talking about JavaScript first thing in the morning. But the thing is about responsive design that I found in recent years is that building and designing a responsive layout isn't really the hard part anymore. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that it's easy or that we've solved all of our problems. But instead, as I've seen responsive design move further and further into the mainstream, as I've seen larger digital organizations work with it, the biggest challenge that I've seen for most responsive practices is actually documenting and communicating how, why, and when their responsive designs actually adapt and change. What are the decisions that went into shaping the design? So that's why I've actually think it's incredibly gratifying to sort of see the rise of the style guide as a potential solution to this problem. Now, your team might call them style guides, maybe your team calls them pattern libraries. Unfortunately, this is one of those areas where the English language has completely and utterly failed us. I tend to call them pattern libraries myself, but I also kind of have to read the room, generally, by and large, depending on who I'm speaking with. But at the end of the day, I mean, a pattern library or a style guide is really just what it sounds like. It's a web interface that allows you to actually access all the individual components and design patterns that go into powering a larger responsive UI. Starbucks.com actually relaunched with a responsive experience back in 2011, and when they did that, they did something interesting. They released their pattern library to the public, which hadn't really ever been done before at that scale. So whether you worked at Starbucks or external to the organization, you could browse through their pattern library and see all the individual components and modules in isolation from each other, but also in partnership with other patterns across the library. So this is a really wonderful tool to see how Starbucks would build more complex layouts and section fronts and product pages working from very simple, discrete components. Ushahidi is a really wonderful example as well. It's a little bit more of a modern pattern library. Ushahidi basically develops open source software for data visualization and interactive mapping. It's a fairly robust software platform that's used across the globe, especially in developing markets. And their pattern library is beautifully designed and also beautifully laid out. So you can move from one end of the pattern library to the other and see, again, how very simple little design patterns like links and headline styles can be combined together and made progressively more complex, evolving all the way up into site headers or footers or interactive maps. Now, I would go so far as to say that, at least in my practice, a pattern library or a style guide has quickly become the de facto artifact to come out of a responsive design process. And if you can invest the time in creating a pattern library or a style guide and also maintaining it over time, that's the trick. You're going to reap many benefits. The first and foremost one is the one that a lot of developers talk about, which is that it creates a central shared repository for all the front-end patterns and code that go into powering your site or your application. But it also affords you a lot of software organizational benefits as well. Many teams actually find that it helps them bridge a collaboration gap internally that has traditionally existed between design and engineering. A lot of teams that I work with have found that designers no longer need to rely on traditional graphic design tools like Sketch or Illustrator. Instead, they can partner directly with an engineering resource to actually prototype new pages and features by pulling patterns directly from their library. It can also help with onboarding new team members who need to orient themselves in their your visual framework. It can also help with facilitating automated testing of your responsive experiences as well. Now, if you're interested in creating a pattern library or a style guide, good luck. If you haven't created one, you've got a little bit of work in front of you. But if you haven't created one, I mean, really at the end of the day, it's a three-step process. And I'd like to work through each one of those very quickly. Basically, it involves creating a visual inventory of all the patterns that are powering your design, of naming and organizing all those patterns in a clear and sensible way, and then finally translating that inventory into a web-ready interface. So this is what that process kind of looks like for me. So to create a visual inventory, it's basically a process of actually browsing through an interface, whether it's been redesigned or it's about to be redesigned, and cataloging all the patterns you find. Now, basically the way that I do this is I just have a browser running and I'm browsing through this website and I'm basically keeping a sketch file open and I'm just sort of screenshotting in all the patterns that I find inside that experience. I'm not looking for every headline or every link or every button, but unique treatments of them. Those are the design patterns I'm trying to document. From there, I've basically got like a big jumble of patterns inside of this document, so then I need to kind of apply a little bit of order and sensibility to them. So then I basically look at those patterns and I try to create associations between them and group like-minded patterns together, and then name each one of those patterns sensibly. And then also name the categories of those patterns sensibly. The goal of this phase is to ensure that folks other than me can actually quickly and easily find the pattern that they need to work with at that particular point in time. Once I've done that, then I actually need to translate this inventory into HTML and CSS. Now, when I worked with Atos, they had a relatively modest number of design patterns that they were working with. So what we ended up doing was we just created a static HTML document so that an editor could basically browse through this one web page and quickly find the pattern and the code that powered it when they were creating a new page or a new experience. Now, if I was doing this today, pretty much on every pattern library project since then, I would strongly recommend automating this process rather than manually creating a static HTML file. The goal is ultimately to have your pattern library and your production application remain in sync so that changes in one are reflected in the other. If you're interested in this process, Susan Robertson wrote one of the finest roundups of different tools and libraries to help you support that more automated workflow for producing an inventory. But regardless, I mean, basically this is a three-step process at the end of the day, which is not an easy one. But the reason I wanted to walk through it is because I think as an industry, we've done a really wonderful job about talking about the first and third steps in creating a pattern library. And the one that we don't talk about as much is the one that I would actually argue is the most critical to a successful pattern library, and in fact, to a successful digital experience, which is the naming and organizing of patterns in a clear and sensible way. A designer that I really respect and admire, a woman named Colma Tova, once said that modularity might appear to be a simple concept at first, but actually making it work for your team demands significant effort and commitment. She goes on to say that language is fundamental to collaboration. In short, we should start with language rather than interfaces. I couldn't agree more with Ala because it perfectly represents my experiences working with pattern libraries at scale. What's more, this also reminds me of a story about a boat. Now, this boat's name is the Hokulea, and more specifically, it's a large voyaging canoe powered entirely and only by the wind in its sails. And in 1976, the crew of the Hokulea actually made a decision to take it on a very beautiful but also incredibly difficult journey, more specifically between 2 points on the Pacific Ocean, between 2 historically island nations, between Hawaii and Tahiti. Now, those 2 points on the Pacific Ocean are separated by some 2,500 miles, and if you or I were to fly between those points, it would take basically about 10 hours to cross that distance, and the Hokulea did it in 30 days. What was remarkable about this journey wasn't the distance or the time it took them to cross it, but the fact that they crossed this distance without the aid of any contemporary navigational equipment. No computers, no sextants, no compasses, and no modern maps. And they were able to complete this completely analog, completely offline journey thanks to the efforts of one man in particular, a man named Pius Mau Piailug, who was a navigator from a small island in Satawal called Micronesia. And Mau was actually schooled in traditional Polynesian navigation techniques, many of which were hundreds and hundreds of years old. And in fact, this is what the crew of the Hokulea was actually trying to honor, this tradition of navigating the ocean. And these techniques were based on navigating the sea by the stars, by the sun and the moon, or on a cloudy night by studying the direction of the ocean's waves. Now, one of the most important instruments in Mau's tradition never actually made it onto the boat with him, which is something called a star compass, which is a very simple-looking circle of rocks or shells with a point that's fixed in the center. Now, I have a very brief video of Mau using this in a teaching context. I'm just going to play a very brief clip of it for you. There's a little bit of audio here you may not be able to pick up. But basically what's happening here is that Mau is actually chanting, and it's a very plaintive song. And as he does so, he's actually pointing at each one of the rocks in turn, moving around the circle very slowly as he sings to his students. It's a really beautiful video. I recommend checking it out because it's really fascinating to watch this process work. And it looks very simple, but there's actually a number of different things happening here at once. You see, every stone in the compass represents one constellation in the sky, and the center of the compass represents the boat that Mau and the navigator and his or her crew would be sitting upon. And the chant that he's singing as he points at each stone in turn is the navigator naming the stars in the sky one by one, which is helping navigators understand not just the sky, but the boat's position relative to it. So this is how navigators in Mau's tradition learned, through song, yes, which is beautiful, but more importantly, by establishing a shared common language that was passed on from generation to generation. And the tradition itself is beautiful, yes, but what I think is really beautiful is actually the consistency that that tradition engenders. Because by memorializing this order, it helps navigators in Mau's tradition understand the position of the boat to the sky, but also to make decisions when they're out on the water facing live conditions and the compass was back on land. That consistency is so key to digital design for the modern web and for pattern libraries as well. Colma Tova basically says that by naming an element in your pattern library, that determines how the element will be used and helps to ensure that it's used consistently by everyone. The biggest challenges that most pattern-driven design practices face, at least in my experience, are everything that follows on after you've created your pattern library, to ensure that every member of your team or every member of your organization knows when it's appropriate to reuse an existing module and when to create a new one. How to avoid making modules duplicate each other, to ensure that they're distinct enough, to avoid duplications that different teams might be contributing to the pattern library, and so on and so forth. The technology that we use to create our pattern libraries is not going to be solving any of these problems. Instead, I would actually argue that naming and language are what create a shared understanding around your design patterns. And that's what creates more consistent designs and products and applications. I mention this because one of the more popular metaphors for talking about digital design and pattern-driven design specifically is something called atomic design. And this is a really wonderful metaphor for thinking about how different page-driven interfaces can be broken down into very discrete pieces. So in the atomic design metaphor, you have atoms on one end of the spectrum, which are basically single HTML elements. And then they get progressively more complex over time as they're combined together, and they build all the way up into full templates or full page layouts. But what a lot of organizations have actually found is that this language can get in the way of the way that they collaborate. Let me give you an example. Let's say you or I was creating a visual inventory off of a responsive experience, and we were working with the atomic design classification system. And we're working with this one particular pattern that I found on this responsive experience, this really beautiful search pattern that's a full-width, flexible text field on wider screens, but on smaller mobile devices, you tap or click on an element, and something springs into view with that lovely little bit of animation. This is a great pattern, so we need to find a home for it, not just in our pattern library, but inside of this classification scheme that atomic design gives us. Now, this is obviously not an atom. It's more complex than a single HTML element. It's obviously not a full template or a full page layout. So that means it sits somewhere in the middle. It's either a molecule or an organism. And unfortunately, the atomic design guidelines aren't especially clear about where moderately complex patterns like this would fall in this schema. I want to be very clear. This is not a life-threatening issue. Every person in this room could probably find an answer to this question. Is this search pattern a molecule or an organism? But the thing is that we wouldn't all agree. And in fact, most teams I've worked with would not all agree. This is where that possibility for organizational friction creeps in, because if somebody can't find the pattern that they need to work with using the language you've designed, that's where it slows down the velocity. In other words, what I've found more often than not is that a style guide's success or failure often hinges upon the words that teams use to talk about it. Now, regardless of the terms that you use, whether it's atoms and molecules or blocks and components, before you commit to any metaphor, ensure that every single member of your team or organization shares the same level of understanding about those terms that you do. Because at the end of the day, a good style guide uses language and metaphors that are meaningful to your organization, and more specifically to the people that are responsible for maintaining it. This is something that Colma Tova, that designer I've quoted a couple times, has written about extensively. She's recently published a book about this challenge. And she's basically said that the process of creating a pattern library shouldn't be something that a single designer or developer does, but instead needs to be a cross-discipline, cross-team, organizational-wide effort whenever possible. So make it as collaborative as possible at the end of the day. So for example, a visual inventory should be something that an entire group does. So have every member of your team basically review these patterns one by one and actually collaboratively name those things based on their high-level function. The benefit to this process is that you can uncover potential overlaps, which Alla actually did, where they found two modules that were actually promoting pieces of content that also had a very similar visual style. So this more collaborative review helped their entire team not just notice this redundancy, but also to talk about their shared common purpose, which is to focus the user's attention on a very critical action. So as a result, once they had that shared understanding, they as a team could actually decamp and actually come up with a replacement module that gets rid of that visual redundancy and eliminates two redundant patterns and drives it down into one. But what's even more powerful about this pattern isn't just the visual redundancy being eliminated, but the fact that every member of Alla's team actually now understands the high-level function of this particular module, and they know how best to use it in their products and in their applications. The goal of this product is to integrate your design language into your company culture, and I would actually argue at the end of the day that this can help kick off a discussion not just about design patterns, but design principles. It helps your entire team from the ground up talk about what constitutes good digital design across all of the patterns you're designing and contributing into your products. And in doing so, that's going to help you better in the future design patterns you don't necessarily know you need today. Because at the end of the day, when you combine design patterns with those design principles, that's the beginning of a design system. That's what elevates a simple collection of patterns and front-end snippets into something that an entire organization can use as a design tool to guide the products and applications that are going to be invented in the future. In other words, they're a compass that will help you guide your digital and responsive design efforts. Because at the end of the day, this question that I asked in the beginning, that Todd asked even before me, where are we going? Nobody can know the answer to this question. What I do know as a designer is that I'm constantly reminded in my work that the web doesn't evolve in a single straight line. And for many of you who work in mobile exclusively, you're probably more aware of this than I. It's always helpful for me to remember that our audiences aren't necessarily on the latest and best hardware or using the most modern software. Because we've seen remarkable advances as we move further and further beyond the desktop, but it's also worth checking some of our assumptions about where things are going to be going. Because yes, mobile is still exploding, but it's also worth remembering that mobile growth has, by and large, not necessarily come at the expense of desktop in many markets. It's been additive traffic rather than reductive. And yes, tablet computing is incredibly exciting, and I love using mine every day, but market analysts and even tablet manufacturers alike have been pointing down to a slowing of the tablet market, if not an outright decline. And there's been a considerable amount of post-desktop experimentation, and I dearly hope it continues. I'm excited to see what we'll be designing for next. But it's also worth remembering that there hasn't been a single candidate that has approached the same level of viability and market penetration that we saw in mobile computing. And what's more, that word mobile is incredibly narrow, I think, as we talk about it in our industry. And I'm constantly presented with reminders of that in my design practice. I've been looking at a lot of the photographs that have been coming out of the Syrian refugee crisis, which is one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our times. And there's been this one quiet through line throughout some of these incredibly difficult photographs that I've been seeing, which are smartphones. And these smartphones may not necessarily be the same ones that you and I have in this room. And in fact, they're much less powerful and much less expensive. And they're being used in incredibly life-threatening and arduous conditions. But they're all just as capable of accessing the products and the sites that we design and build on a daily basis, which is why I'm incredibly heartened by our industry's general pivot toward this term, the next billion. Basically a general acknowledgement that the next billion people to be coming online won't be coming from developed markets like the United States or from Western Europe, but from parts of the globe that we haven't necessarily been traditionally designing for in the last few years. And a designer and researcher named Ann Chalmina said that this is basically the greatest challenge facing the digital industry today, that some of the next billion to come online are taking boats across the Mediterranean, the South China Sea, and elsewhere. They will have smartphones. So in the next few years, I think we are well positioned as an industry to begin by creating more pattern-driven responsive sites, which are hopefully informed by well-articulated, device-agnostic design principles. If we can do that, that's going to ensure that our work can move beyond our devices and will be accessible on theirs. So let's start today and think about better ways that we can start designing for them. Because if we can do that, I can't think of better stars to set our ship by. With that, I'd like to thank you so much for your time.